Thank you very much, Professor Kidd, for taking my interview today. As we speak, the Beijing Winter Olympics has kicked off. We've heard so far from some complaints from the participants about the strict COVID rules undertaken by the organizers. Some call them unreasonable, some are crying for losing their chances to compete, or about the quarantine conditions. How do you see the extra stress put on the athletes in this year's games because of the pandemic and because of the way that China uses to deal with it?
I agree that the athletes are under terrible stress. Certainly the athletes who arrived and were placed into quarantine were experienced very difficult extreme conditions from everything I've read. For the athletes in the Olympic Village, it's very, very strict conditions, and for the journalists too. And that means that this is not a real Olympics or a full Olympics or the kind of Olympics that every Olympic athlete and person in the world wants. That being said, I take the seriousness of the pandemic as very real. And I know that China has been very strict all over China, not just in Beijing for the Olympics. I don't have a strong feeling about whether those restrictions are unreasonable. What I most want to say is that I admire the athletes from all countries who are determined to compete well under these terrible circumstances and are, closing their eyes and ears to the restrictions and just focusing on their events and focusing on their interactions with other athletes when they can.
Sure, it's not easy to pursue their Olympic dreams under such circumstances. Another concern raised by those attending the Games is about cybersecurity. Athletes are required to use the My 2022 app to monitor their health before and during the Olympics. As we know, the FBI has urged people to leave their personal cell phone at home and be wary of any applications required by the Chinese government, as they might be used to steal personal information or install tracking tools. Do you share the same concern?
Yes, I do. I think people have to be prepared that what they say and what they communicate will be reviewed. It's very scary for many people, and I've never had to operate in that circumstance, so I don't know what I would do in those. I guess I would be proud of everything I did and said and let the listeners hear that, but that's a luxury of somebody in a liberal democratic country.
We've seen the Olympic officials and the Chinese government warned the athletes against staging any protests at the Games, saying that it could violate the Olympic rules as well as the Chinese law and subject to punishment. So, but some activists are urging the athletes to use their platform, to use their celebrity to speak out. So as a former Olympian, if you would give advices to those attending this year's Games, what would you say? Should they speak out or should they just keep subject on mind but not on lips?
Well, I wouldn't tell them what to do or say. I respect that is their right, but I would not discourage them if they wanted to speak out. I think that during the last couple of years that the athletes of the world have successfully won the right for free open expression at Olympic and Winter Olympic Games, and that right should be protected, and the IOC should protect that right. As you will remember, in Tokyo last summer, a few athletes, not a lot, but a significant number, spoke out on a variety of concerns. And I think the same rights should be enjoyed in Beijing. these are Beijing's games, but they're also the world's games, and they belong to the Olympic world. And every member of that community should be treated with the rights of all Olympians, and should not be subject to punitive Chinese law.
But some people argue that we should keep politics out of sports. Otherwise, it's against the spirit of Olympics. What would be your response to that?
Well, I think that's a misreading of the Olympic ideal. The Olympic ideal is to bring everyone together from all over the world, despite and because of our differences. But not to ignore those differences in political systems, or religious beliefs, or feelings, but to make those differences the subject of what we can discuss with each other. And so my interpretation of the Olympic spirit is that because we have these differences, we should get together, respect people for these differences, and have a peaceful discussion about them. But to go to a place like China and not talk about China, or go to the United States and not talk about the things that bother us about the United States, or come to Canada and not talk about the things that bother other people about Canada, that's not in the Olympic spirit. We should do this respectfully and peacefully, but we should have the right to have those discussions. I worry that COVID and the health measures make that less possible, but that doesn't rule out the basic right of Olympians to speak freely on what's on their mind.
So how do you see the Rule 50 of the IOC Charter? Is this time to change it?
Well, everyone is holding their breath. I don't know whether athletes will say things that will upset the Chinese government, but if they say them in the spirit of the revised Rule 50, in a respectful way, but an honest way, then the IOC should protect them. And as I've said and written, if the Chinese government steps, on the field or into those press conferences and goes to arrest any athlete, then the IOC should say the games are over, we cancel them right now. Because those are basic Olympic rights that should be protected. And I'd like to think that the Chinese government, big and powerful as it is, I laugh that they are so afraid of 2,000 Olympic athletes saying what's on their mind. That's nuts.
We have over 2,500 athletes competing in this Beijing Winter Olympics, and as you just mentioned, some of them seem to have a pretty good time over there. They post happy videos on their social media, praising the facilities, showing gratitude to the volunteers, or just sharing the vibe theirs. And sometimes those athletes are criticized for giving credit to the authoritarian regime for playing into the Chinese government's propaganda. Some critics are even saying they shouldn't be there in the first place. They should have boycotted these games. Do you think it's fair to those athletes?
No, I don't. These are the Olympic Games. For most of those athletes, this will be their only Olympics. They should go and enjoy them. It's taken great courage to go under these very difficult circumstances. They've had to train in terrible circumstances, as we all know. They're meeting with people who are like them from all over the world. They're meeting with the Chinese volunteers and the Chinese officials, and having enjoyable conversations with that. And I think that's what the Olympic spirit should be. I'm critical of what the Chinese government has done with respect to the Uyghurs in Hong Kong and Tibet myself. But the Olympic spirit is, even those, because of these differences, Olympic sport should should go ahead. And we should go peacefully to talk. We shouldn't avoid going to China or any country which has different political ideas and a different record. If there was a high standard for human rights in every aspect set out by the United Nations Declaration on Universal Human Rights or the other charters, and that was the bar for awarding the Olympic Games, the Olympics would be in Sweden all the time. It'd never come back to Canada. It would never go to the United States. It'd never go to China. I mean, that's not who we are. The Olympic movement is about having sport around the world and in a peaceful, respectful way, interacting with people unlike ourselves.
So apparently the athletes are put in a very difficult situation, but you don't blame IOC for that. You don't think it's because the IOC made a wrong choice of host the country in 2015?
Well, they had a very limited choice, and they had little other. I am sure that the IOC wishes they had that choice again. But I'm sure they also wish there were other bid cities. The IOC has always sought to engage national communities and host cities without strict requirements around human rights. In the last 10 or 15 years, people are urging the consideration of human rights in the staging of Olympic Games, but we have not agreed to that. And I don't think there is a worldwide consensus on what that means. We're struggling towards that. But in the meantime, the old ideal of reaching out to everyone still makes a lot of sense to me in this difficult world.
Yes, people used to hope that Olympics would bring positive changes to the host nations who, originally might be lagging behind in democracy or human rights.
I never believed that. What I believed is that we could, it's unrealistic to think that 2,800 athletes are going to change a country of 1.2 billion people in 3 weeks of sports. That's unrealistic. But what we can do is contribute in our own way to a dialogue between different peoples.
But speaking of bringing people together, it seems like the nationalism is playing a even bigger and bigger role in the games. If we look at this Beijing Winter Olympics, all the controversy around the nationality of some athletes who was raised up in States but competing for China, or the social media clash between Chinese and South Korean netizens over some games and open ceremony. So is the Olympics really a bridge to bring people together, or is merely just a reflection of how divided we are right now?
Well, that's a good question. And I think there is justification for everything you say. And as one of my friends, John McAloon of the University of Chicago, says, the Olympics is a multiple narrative. There are many simultaneous stories. And on the one hand, there's been a disturbing increase in nationalism. On the other hand, there's been an encouraging reaching out. At a time of horrible nationalism and xenophobia, the idea of bringing the world together under peaceful sport is very encouraging to me and very important to me. If you look at the way that athletes in Beijing are hugging each other, high-fiving each other, posing for photographs with each other from very different countries, that shows the spirit of internationalism.
The IOC has been criticized for closing up with authoritarian regimes. They said probably that's because they haven't put enough pressure on China. They haven't urged China to live up to their promises and hold China accountable for not doing so. Do you agree?
I do agree with that, although I don't know what's happening behind the scenes. There is an IOC tradition of behind the scenes diplomacy. So we don't know for sure, but I don't think, but on the public face of it, I do not think the IOC has done enough to push the Chinese government to an acceptance of all cultures in the games.
Why it is the case? Because, undeniable, China is a huge market. There is something, the Olympics or any other international sports events. And, their sponsors have to take into consideration if they want to spend, if they want to make themselves more relevant. So how should they, choose or strike balance?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I would say in this, while I'm critical of the IOC, I wouldn't want Thomas Bach's job because he is getting pressure from all sides. He has an obligation to see that these games go through. He doesn't want to totally anger the host government because they have enormous power. He wants sponsors and investors to continue their investments. The revenue of many sports organizations around the world, winter and summer, is dependent upon the IOC in these games. So there's a lot resting on this, and he is being understandably cautious about not picking any fights. So I think the questions you ask are good questions. They're not easy for the IOC to answer.
Would you call for any reforms to the Olympic movement or any changes to the IOC?
Well, the IOC has promised for 2024 strict requirements for human rights in the staging of the Olympics, not in all aspects of French society, but in the staging of the Olympics in Paris. That's a good place to start. I would also like to see human rights for participants realized in all Olympic competing countries. Not for everybody in those countries, but for the people who are involved in sport. Those would be two very difficult challenges, but they're within sport, within the ability of sport to affect change. I think the IOC should try harder to realize that. And if that happens over the next 10 or 15 years, I think that would be a big breakthrough.